Welcome to the Book of Urm, Tales of Piecora, the Haunted Fortress. Chapter 18, Grunaeirmond. Grunaeirmond. Ravsesi sat shivering on the couch in the darkness while clutching one of the ship's crest-emblazoned oil lamps with both hands in her lap. Ensconced in the ship's brig, she was cold inside despite the room's stagnant warmth and the film of perspiration on her pale skin. She focused on her breathing, inhaling through her nose and exhaling through her sharp teeth, hissing like a wet snake. Doglir and Piecora stood on either side of the barricaded exit door of the prison, weapons gripped and muscles tensed, ready for whatever might try to forcefully gain entrance. The room's flickering lamplight glinted from their perspiring bare skin and faces, sculpting them into chiselled vignettes formed from the darkness itself. But nothing came through the door, and no sounds were heard from the other side except for the strange, low hum of the sovereignty that emanated all around them. After tensely waiting for a while, Piecora suddenly dropped her arms, lowered her Cynthian hatchet, rolled her neck muscles, and sighed heavily, as if the anticipation alone fully worked her muscles. She looked over at Ravsez and said tiredly, "Stay here. We're going to take a look outside." "I shall not," Ravsesi said indignantly. Her quivering voice rang far louder than intended. "I'm coming with you wherever you go." "Sounds familiar," muttered Doglir, but then he cowered beneath the withering stares from Piecora and Ravsez. Piecora and Doglir slid the table to the side and slowly creaked the door outward from the prison. After several more moments of uneasy silence, Piecora irritatingly shoved the door all the way open with her hatchet and stepped outside with Doglir close behind. Ravsesi slid from the couch and stepped toward the door as Piecora looked behind at her and said quietly, "Get me one of the lamps." Ravsesi grabbed two of the lit lamps from the prison room walls and handed one to Piecora and the other to Doglir. Piecora then crept slowly forward into the darkness of the outer chamber with the lamp in front of her, looking cautiously from side to side. Doglir stepped out of the room and over to the side to explore a different part of the area. Ravsez stood in the doorway, holding her lamp in both hands, trying to control her shaking and breathing. Her mouth had gone completely dry, and her eyes ached. She was too afraid to leave the brig until one of her companions declared it was safe to come out. She watched both lamplights move in different directions until she heard one of them hiss and snap their fingers. The other lamplight hastened over to it, loudly tripped over something metal, then came jogging back to Ravsez. Light illuminated Doglir's face before her. He said nothing, but held out his hand to Ravsez. Ravsez hesitated for a moment as she doubted everything lately, but he waved his fingers impatiently, beckoning her to hurry up and take his hand. Making up her mind, she grabbed his hand, and he pulled her quickly across the expanse of darkness until they stood beside Piecora. They faced a wall opposite from the prison, looking down at several broken planks. Within the debris of splintered wood, iron straps and spilled liquor, lay Wilhelmina, or Willie, the Muthen engineer who knew the Sovereignty's designs better than anyone. Her head was twisted and bent at an angle incompatible with human anatomy. "She must have tried to join us in the prison like we planned," whispered Piecora. "We need to find the others." Ravsez could only stare at Wilhelmina's broken body in shock and sorrow, mourning that she never got to know the young Muthan woman, and now it was too late. She just couldn't believe the nightmare that was quickly unfolding on the Sovereignty as it sailed over the mountains. Together they moved along the wall, where more signs of struggle were revealed by their combined lamplight. Torn sacks of grain spilled over the floor, tools strewn about, and spatters of blood merged with the assassin creature's ooze. They descended a long flight of stairs that led to the ship's hold, just above the bilge of the ship near the bottom of the hull itself. "This is where the fight took place between you and Cleisthenes, Doglir," Piecora said quietly as she advanced through the darkness. Her eyes never left the ground, as she slowly walked while waving her lamp from side to side. "Why are we down here?" asked Doglia. "They were supposed to take the body to the morgue." "I know," said Piecora with her head lowered. Ravsesi realised that Piecora was reading and tracking clues on the floor. "But this is where it all started, where we made a lot of noise," she said. "I'm curious if that thing came here after we left. Look at the floor over here." She drifted her lamp around her in a slow circle. "There's more blood here than before. The marks are different, dragging this way and that. Bare feet. That's strange. The marks lead over here." Piecora slowly walked in the direction she was facing until the edge of her lamplight slowly revealed a gruesome sight. Piled up against the back corner of the hold among several discarded crates, boxes and supplies, she discovered the heaped bodies of those who joined the hunting party with Piecora earlier in the evening, including the captain of the Sovereignty, Ogiomvdol, the Sienjan of Bear. Ravsesi gasped loudly, filling her lungs painfully with air as she fell to her knees and stared at the unthinkable tragedy before her. The air stuck in her lungs, refusing to be exhaled no matter how hard she tried. None of this seemed to be real to her. "Curses unto the damned!" rumbled Doglia beneath his breath as he moved closer to the bodies. He held his lamp over the pile of fresh bodies, studying the open-eyed, horror-stricken, frozen faces of the victims, and demanded, "What is this? What is happening here? This looks like the captain. What in the blackened earth is going on?" Piecora showed no emotion as she slowly walked to the other side of the pile and lifted a small crossbow from the top of a barrel against the wall. It was the same design as the one used in Rultin's sagery. She shook it, then held it to her nose and sniffed. "Weapon of Kelganistan assassins," she said. "This one is spent, I believe, out of poison. Probably exhausted its charges on these poor people. It'll have to resort to more direct measures if it desires to keep killing, which I have no doubt it does." She laid the weapon back down and said, "We need to warn Sifa. She'll be next." Ravsesi looked up at Piecora, just in time to see a face looming into the lamplight behind her friend. She recognised the garish visage of Vinexi, the Unscavian from Coast Haven, smiling devilishly from ear to ear, his red goat's pupils dilated to mere pinpricks in their lamplit sclerae. Before Ravsesi could release the air in her lungs, Vinexi grabbed Piecora by the throat with one hand and squeezed. Piecora jolted backward, dropping both lamp and hatchet onto the floor, and reached for Vinexi's strangling hand with both of hers. She lunged furiously backwards with her antlers into Vinexi's face like an ambushed gazelle, piercing his left eye and cheek with their deadly points. From these wounds came a bubbling, clear, gelatinous substance, the stuff that constituted the changeling creature that attacked them in Rultin's sagery. Finally, the creature had revealed itself using the same guise as the one before, the Unscavian Coast Havener rat thief who claimed he would never set foot in the wildlands again. Ravsesi shut her eyes, threw her arms over her head, and finally emptied her burning lungs in a guttural scream that echoed throughout the ship's Byzantine lower decks and passageways. "Fiend from hell!" roared Doglia, leaping over Ravsesi at the creature. His shoulder impacted the changeling on the side of its boneless torso as his own lamp fell to the ground beside Ravsesi's, and the two went sprawling into the darkness. Piecora then crumpled to the floor like a broken doll. A cacophony of sound from the two fierce combatants filled Ravsesi's ears from the nearby darkness as she crawled over Piecora's limp body and lifted her head. Just beneath Piecora's ribs on her left side, Ravsesi felt hot wetness quickly spreading across Piecora's shirt. She screamed again, this time with words. "It has a blade!" Reaching out, she grabbed one of the fallen lamps and held it over Piecora's face to find her dark eyes staring open, and a bruise from the assassin's chokehold already blooming across her throat, slick with the creature's wet slime. But Ravsesi knew this was only meant for leverage to employ the fatal wound beneath Piecora's ribs. Ravsez held her ear close to Piecora's mouth and heard weak rattling breaths. Pressing her ear to Piecora's chest, she heard Piecora's racing heart quickly slowing down. Feeling utterly helpless and terrified, Ravsez covered Piecora's eyes with her hand and threw her arms around her, sobbing uncontrollably. A hand roughly gripped her shoulder, and without thinking, Ravsez swung the lamp wildly in a whistling arc that would have fully disfigured Doglia's face if he hadn't dodged it in the last moment. "It's fled! It's wounded! It's heading upstairs!" he shouted in between breaths through gritted teeth. Ravsez noticed he had several fresh wounds added to the ones previously wrapped by Piecora, now soaked in dark blood. For an instant, she again questioned whether this was the real Doglia or the assassin in his guise as it moved to its next victim, but the fresh blood from his wounds convinced her that he was true. "Come on!" he shouted, shaking her again. "We must get upstairs and warn the others." "No!" Ravsez wailed. "I cannot leave her." "You must," Doglia countered. "I'm not leaving you alone down here. We must get upstairs before that thing does any more killing." Ravsez's mind drifted randomly between thoughts of lying in bed with Piecora in the early morning, shopping in Knightsport for clothes and supplies with Cassandra Blalos, Otor helping Roltin load their gear onto the pumpkin cart while on their way to Alagost, hearing Otor laughing with Valesh as they splashed each other in one of the baths in Callistico Mansion, far beneath the city. Her mind lingered on holding Piecora's hand as they walked through the snow in Alagost toward Magnusciolio, the big hole where Callistico Mansion fell. She recalled observing the perfect footprints her soft boots left in the fine snow with each step, as Piecora shared the story about her connection with Hiero. When Ravsez remarked how beautiful the story sounded to her, Piecora squeezed her hand in response. The simple, wordless gesture sent a wave of warmth up her arm and caused her heart to flutter unexpectedly. In that moment, she had discovered her feelings for the Xianjian guide. Otto's voice suddenly spoke in her mind as clear as an unexpected thunderclap on a sunny day. "Mumi." The voice filled her mind completely, pushing everything else out. It was stern, disciplinary, commanding, and it rattled her from her stupor. Something gripped her other arm and clawed up her shirt, and turning to look down, she saw Piecora's eyes were open again, staring back at Ravsez. Piecora's hand pulled her down by the front of her blouse so that her face hovered closely over Piecora's. "Go," Piecora whispered weakly. "I can't," Ravsez began, but Piecora yanked her further down, touching their foreheads together. "I will be with you," gurgled Piecora, as blood emerged from the corners of her mouth and seeped from her nostrils. "Seek Hiero. Find the impostor. Point." "How will I know?" cried Ravsez hysterically, with tears streaming down her face. "It will be one of us from below. One of the dead." Piecora sighed heavily, then stopped breathing. Her hand fell from Ravsez, and her head turned limply to the side with her eyes remaining open and unfocused. Ravsez stared in hopeless agony, but Doglia shook her again by the shoulder. "What did she say?" he asked hurriedly. "We must leave Ravsez, please." Of all the emotions triggered at once by Doglia's unsympathetic impatience, anger boiled to the top and detonated quietly behind her suddenly serene, lifeless expression, burning away everything inside and leaving behind a cold, sterile wind blowing through the frozen void of her hollowed being, purifying her featureless landscape of all remaining emotional contamination. Ravsez's self-identity and core functions completely shut down, leaving her with infinite emptiness, purged of all that she was before. This emptiness had its own identity, finally revealed to her for the first time, and it was familiar. She had been this person before, a long time ago, unencumbered by sentimentality, warmth, or humanity. Within this barren, icy landscape of her ancient heritage lay a cold, thin, atmospheric haze of primal lust that filled her awareness and reached every hidden recess in her mind, yearning for only one thing: total domination. The ruby ring on her left middle finger suddenly froze like ice, spreading purple discoloration from her finger and scrawling through her pale hand that pressed against Piecora's mortal knife wound in her side. She felt a subtle vibration within her hand, and Piecora's wet shirt began to freeze solid around her fingers. Colour started to fade from Piecora's face, and her eyes glazed over as Ravsese felt Piecora's warmth pass into the ring. Across the frozen landscape she heard her own voice, distantly screaming in anguish, but it no longer mattered to her. Everything was simple now for her to understand, and with that simplicity came power over everyone and everything subjugated to her. Ravsese was violently yanked from Piecora, and like a withering dream, the vision evaporated. She buried her frozen hand under her right arm as she blinked wildly at Piecora's lifeless body on the floor, her heart mourning all over again for her lost beloved. Dahlia spun her around and grabbed both her shoulders, and with fear in his eyes he said, "Ravsese, we must get upstairs. Now." It took her a few moments to remember who he was, then remember why he was here, and then put together where they were and what was happening. A distantly lingering part of her mind found it curious that she would care so much about a man such as this. A man of House Veklische, of the line of Cannoneer Buren MacCannon, a sworn enemy of her people. The thought of bearing his offspring was unconscionable. Puffs of cold mist emerged from her mouth and nose, as if it was in the middle winter here in the black depths of the sovereignty. Dorglia's eyes widened and he whispered, "Who are you?" But the lingering enmity finally left her, and her frozen hand regained its warmth as the ring's power dissipated before completing its task. She once again recognized Doglia and all of her complicated feelings for him. She looked down at Piecora, and her heart swelled with renewed grief, love, and all of the complicated feelings for her. Her mind reeled at the deluge of returning emotions flooding the void that had briefly overtaken her. She knelt down beside Piecora and delicately closed Piecora's eyes again. She wiped away stray braids from Piecora's face, slightly adjusted the antlers on Piecora's head, and stood up. Then, slowly, she bent down and picked up an oil lamp branded with the sovereignty crest on its brass base, and turned to face Doglia without lifting her head. She seethed through her teeth. "Upstairs, now, we'll know who it is." Doglia silently nodded, his expression confused, grim and mournful. Holding his sword in one hand, he took her hand in his other, and together they raced through the dark lower decks of the Sovereignty to reach the party above as quickly as they possibly could. Ravsese and Doglia entered the dark common room to the sound of loud, pounding music from above. Ravsese's lamplight revealed more victims claimed by the changeling assassin lying on the floor. Pools of blood mingled together and seeped into the floorboards. It astounded Ravsese that nobody upstairs on the top deck had yet noticed the bodies just beneath their feet. Breathless and fatigued, they continued without stopping, stepping over the bodies. Urged on by the bleak possibility that the music still playing indicated the party must be still happening, they feared the people above might still be unaware of the nightmare unfolding within the Sovereignty's lower decks. "Sifa, is she the one who is second in line?" Doglia asked quietly. Ravsese nodded her head, while still trying to catch her breath. "It might choose Sifa last then with all these people about," muttered Doglia. "Try to eliminate as many of them as possible while they stand in its way. Blackened hells, what a calamity. We have to find her quickly." Crossing the room, Doglia led Ravsese up the wide companionway until they stood on the top deck's forecastle, at the fore of the ship. The musicians played in full force on the stage in front of the large wooden helm. Orta sat on the Heliclesian's shoulders, playing the jaw harp, while the huge muscular man danced among the other revellers. Seeing Orta alive and well rejuvenated Ravsese, and she felt warmth return to her face and limbs. All the complexities of her true self, the self that she manufactures and chose for her after a lifetime of decisions, impulses and responses known and unknown, came back to her like clustered candles, passing flames between them. Piecora, the signet ring of Tiafuin around her finger, itched her skin as feeling returned to her finger, and she fidgeted with the ring nervously, still unable to take it off. She scanned over the revelling crowd, trying to find Sifa, and in doing so, she became aware of the eerie green light that bathed the entire deck of the ship through the stretched canvas canopy above. She gasped dizzily at the realization of the full green moon despite her own cynicism, and gripping Doglia's bare arm, she leaned close and heard herself say, "Grunaeirmond, the green moon is out, and it is full, with no other moons to restrain it." "Of course it is," seethed Doglia, while also watching the crowd with his one functioning eye. Stepping out from behind the bar on the other side of the dancing crowd, Sifa Penrose appeared in full view with her colourful patchwork long coat and ridiculous wide-brimmed leather hat and colourful feathers. Ravsesi quickly wondered if it was the true Sifa or the assassin in Sifa's guise. But despite all immediate assessments, she could not tell one way or another. She just didn't know Sifa well enough to validate the truth from the impostor. "I see her," she said quietly, "if it is truly her. Now where is the—" "Ah, there is my bright son, Unscavian!" came a voice suddenly from their right. "Like a ghost in the night. Where have you been, and who do you have with you?" Prince Tharil approached them casually, and possibly a little drunk, holding a glass of red wine in each hand. But in the light of Grunaeirmond, his once youthful, angelic face now reflected a ghastly countenance of pretentious and cruel mockery. Doglia stepped in front of Ravsesi and spun his sword up to point directly at the eyes of the prince. Prince Tharil jumped at the unexpected affront, spilling red wine all over his white Dolgothadan garments. The growing stain looked like black ink in the green moonlight. Several people nearby took immediate notice, gasped and recoiled, and shortly after an open space formed around Ravses and Doglia. "Who is this that draws sword against?" declared the prince, slurring his words, but Doglia shouted above him. "Step not 1 foot closer, villain!" boomed Doglia, his raspy voice cracking like a madman. He swept his sword in wide arcs around him. "All of you, back off or eat my steel!" Time slowed for Ravses after that moment, labouring on as if struggling against its own inertia. The music died down as several musicians stopped playing, while those that continued fell awkwardly off-key. In the hazy green light of Grunaeirmond, everyone became a hideous nightmare of themselves. Even Orta's young, laughing face, high above the revellers on Shamku's wide shoulders, became gaunt, hideous, depraved, and his reflective eyes gleamed full of malice in Grunaeirmond's sickly light. Those nearby tumbled and fell as they strove to avoid Doglia's swinging sword. Bottles, glasses and goblets flew in the air. Plates flipped over, sending food and drink over everyone as they crashed onto the deck's floor. Ortor calmly turned to face Ravsesi and lowered the Heliclesian's jaw harp. Ravsesi furrowed her eyes at him as she wondered what could be happening behind her son's cold, distant eyes. Then, fearfully, she wondered if it was truly Ortor at all. Could the assassin mimic children as well? Could it have captured her son's likeness from her own mind? But then she noticed his goat's pupils were full and open, as they should be. Then he smiled warmly, and his ears drew back in an expression of contentment and love of seeing his mother again that exorcised the spell of Grunaeirmond from his face. Her heart briefly soared until just over his shoulder she saw Wilhelmina Weisskramor among the revellers. Wilhelmina Weisskramor, the Muthan engineer whose lifeless body they first discovered outside the Sovereignty's prison far below, now strode towards Sifa from the far side of the party in the hideous light of Grunaeirmond. The Muthan engineer's eye was missing, and several lacerations bubbled and foamed on her face. Without a moment's thought, Ravsese screamed, "Hero!" She frantically looked up and searched over the rigging for the falcon, but he was nowhere to be seen. Everyone was caught off guard by her sudden outburst, including Doglear. She ripped herself away from him and threw herself into the crowd, climbing with her arms and legs onto the heads and shoulders of the crowd. Stretching her thin arm over the crowd, she pointed directly at Willie and screamed, "Hero! Hero!" before falling through the crowd and landing awkwardly onto the wet deck. She spun around on the floor and looked up just as a bright, fiery light from beyond the canvas canopy clove through the green ambience like a curtain revealing the sun. A deafening shriek filled the night sky, accompanied by a column of liquid fire and hot, molten air that pierced the overhead canvas at an angle. It drove through the Wilhelmina simulacrum, immolating it instantly, then continued straight through the forecastle and lower decks. Loud explosions followed, each time jolting the Sovereignty hard, until the fire column blasted through the other side of the ship's hull, sending clouds of debris and pieces of burning wood planks spinning into the open sky. The fire column, led by a vaguely bird-shaped form composed of roaring flames, pivoted beneath the Sovereignty and banked vertically as if bouncing from the clouds below, while the ship began to list hard to the port side. The green ambience of Grunaeirmond evaporated as the canvas canopy burned brightly and quickly over the party. Pieces of flaming canvas fell across the deck as people dropped to the ground and scrambled against the sloping deck. Ravsese heard the shriek again, longer and lower and more distantly, rising straight up from the other side of the ship. Directly above, through the remnants of the smouldering canopy, loomed the great green eye of Grunaeirmond, watching malevolently from its black domain among the stars. But then came the rising column of fire, spinning and ascending vertically in the midst of the full green moon, until it suddenly flashed and bloomed into a colossal bird-like silhouette of white celestial fire before detonating completely. A shockwave of destructive fire and kinetic force rolled across the sky and slammed into the Sovereignty, tearing several wings off and reversing its sails so suddenly that the main foremast cracked and bent backwards, held up only by its rigging. The Sovereignty spun around from the shockwave and began a slow, spiralling descent into the storm below. The green moon, no longer visible in the sky, left the Sovereignty and the surrounding mountains bathed in darkness and starlight. The gargantuan ship groaned mournfully from its punishment, and several people slid down on top of Ravsese as the deck sloped high and to the side. She tried to scramble to the companionway and access the common room, but she was carried away by more people falling from above, and they all slid and piled against the gunwale along the port side of the deck. She heard Sifa's loud voice shouting above the bedlam, "Posts! Man your posts! Douse the fires and cut loose the burning rigging! Lash the foremast and secure it to the deck! Leo, man the fire lines! Gion Jabbar, lean into her! Follow her through line to the other side of the vortex! Then gale swallows, I want her sails full windward! The hull is compromised! Cosmos! Gather your engineers and firemen! Get down there and seal the breaches! Douse the fires and seal the breaches!" The ship shuddered violently as it listed further to the side, and the rest of the burning canopy tore away from its mooring. Musical instruments, tables, chairs, platters, barrels, bottles, and all other forms of civilized entertainment lifted into the air, as if floating in water, then flew into the wake behind the wounded ship. Several cones of billowing smoke belched from both sides of the Sovereignty's injured hull. Across the shaking deck, Ravsese saw the peaks of the mountains now at eye level, grotesquely turned on their side. "Passengers, get below decks!" rang Sifa's clear voice above the wailing winds. "Leo, where in all the gods is Orchid when we need that ragged druid most? Get the wounded below to infirmary and strap down. Windtamers, man the wings and be ready to heave us starboard. Gale swallows, wait on my word to pull the sails windward. Gion Jabbar, steady her at the helm and don't lose her rudders. Skybards, prepare to ignite the pilots and fire the bladders. Keep her above the—" Another explosion from below suddenly drowned out her words. Ravsez watched helplessly as crew figures, both men and women of various disciplines, climbed the rigging up the 3 masts and on the remaining wings along the sides of the ship. Several of them were torn away by the wind and cast flailing into the night sky, their screams swallowed by the storm. "Mumi!" Ravsez barely heard her son's voice cry out. New strength surged through her limbs as she pulled herself up through the twisted mass of people collected around her along the downside railing of the leaning ship. Above, she saw Ortor's head and arms poking out from the companionway stairs, now almost vertical to her perspective. "Ortor!" she cried desperately. Suddenly the ship lurched hard, and several people around her gave way and fell from behind the gunwale into the swirling winds below. A few of them were able to cling to the railing at the last moment. Ravsez hit the railing hard and hooked her left arm around it, locking it with her right arm as her whole body flipped and flew out into the freezing open air beneath the ship like a torn piece of fabric on a clothesline. "Jion Jabbar! Now! Right us hard starboard now!" shouted Sifa, her voice barely a whisper beneath the screaming winds that pummeled Ravsez from every angle. "Drive us through her momentum and pull her up from the loop! Gale swallows now! Full sails on the windward side and seize the crosswinds like they owe you money!" Ravsez glimpsed Sifa hanging onto the rigging attached to the fallen foremast, waving her wide-brimmed, feather-festooned hat in each direction she indicated, clear and visible for all to see. Sifa's long brown hair blew spasmodically in the whipping winds tearing through the ship. The forecastle was now empty of all aspects of the party, except for straggling passengers and crew members still clinging desperately to anything they could. However, Jion Jabbar remained at the helm, with both feet solidly planted on the deck, pulling at the helm with all of his wiry strength. His unkempt long hair and sleeveless leather long coat flailed upward in the howling gales, as if gravity itself had abandoned the ship entirely. Ravsez, dangling from the railing from her bruised, twisted arm, watched in horror as the dark storm clouds once far beneath the Sovereignty began to slowly engulf the ship. She strained her eyes upward through the freezing, icy winds and glimpsed Ortor just before he was pulled back into the companionway. An instant later, a rope flew out from the companionway, skidded over the deck, and fell over the remaining people gathered above and around Ravsez. She saw the Heliclesian man named Shamku swing down the rope with effortless agility. With his feet planted evenly against the leaning deck of the ship, he bounded down to the people still hanging on for their lives. One by one, he scooped them up by his huge, muscular free arm and walked them up to the companionway with his other hand, grasping the rope as they went. When he reached the relative safety of the companionway, he tossed them inside like hay bales into a loft. Finally, after saving nearly a dozen lives, only Ravsez remained with her arms still locked painfully around the railing, and her thin, frail body tossed violently by the winds. Shamku once again descended the rope, then leapt over the railing to hang freely beside Ravsez. He wrapped his huge arm around her torso and yelled, "Let go!" Ravsez, paralysed with fear, found that she couldn't let go of the railing. By now she had lost all feeling in her left arm that was locked and twisted around the railing. Shamku lifted her body in his free arm and pulled, but her arms wouldn't budge. Then Shamku flipped sideways, planted his boot on the railing, and stomped several times, kicking it at several angles until the railing finally splintered. With a powerful last thrust of his boot, the railing gave way into fragmented pieces spinning into the storm. Ravsez's body fell freely into the freezing winds, just as Hero flew by with a long, crooning shriek that passed from her one ear to the other. Behind Hero's burning tail feathers trailed the final smoking remnants of his hidden power. Ravsez watched the falcon through tear-streaked eyes as it banked upward and disappeared behind the billowing sails. Mountain peaks loomed all around her through the storm, and she tumbled in the air as if she were flotsam in white water. Then she heard Piecora's voice. I am with you now, Piecora said calmly and quietly. Piecora, how? Shouted Ravsez into the wailing winds. Hiero and I are soul-bonded, came Piecora's voice again. We were two vessels who shared the same soul. We were singular. To love one is to love us both. Where are you? Ravsezi shouted wildly. My body can no longer house me, Piecora said. Hero and I are now one, and I am now with you, Grunaeirmond. Hero soared back from the midship, acrobatically flitting between debris jettisoned from the careening Sovereignty. He soared low across the angled deck and looped around Ravseze, just as Shamku's great arm retrieved her flailing body from the surrounding storm. With the rope coiled around his other hand, Shamku let his momentum carry them both back to the hull of the ship, beneath the railing. Planting his boots on the hull, he launched himself and Ravsez from the side of the ship and flew high over the forecastle, landing heavily back onto the leaning deck. His feet skidded across the wet deck until he choked more rope around his wrist, pulling the rope taut against its mooring within the companionway. Like he did with the others, Shamku slowly walked up the deck, carefully placing one foot in front of the other, while cinching his rope-coiled hand further up the line until finally he leaped into the companionway stairs and slid down into the angled common room with Ravsez. The dark room was filled with people shouting and crying hysterically, from either the chaos of the moment or the discovery of the bodies already slain earlier by the assassin. Shamku released Ravseza, and she slid further down the slanted floor and landed roughly against the bar beneath a broken stool. Mumi! She heard her son's voice above her, and looking up she saw Artur peering down at her from over the bar. His hair was slicked back as he emerged from a pool of every flavour of liquor the bar had to offer. Mumi, come back here, he shouted. She climbed over the bar with her one functioning arm and splashed into a deep, dark lake of swirling inebriants in the bottom corner behind the bar. The strong, pungent smell of the spilled alcohol burned her eyes and irritated her sensitive skin. Next to her was her son's wet, sticky head just above the surface of the liquor pool, and he laughed gaily when she wiped her wet hair from her face and made eye contact with him. Suddenly, the ship lurched, and the angled floor began quaking violently and rising upward. The ship's superstructure creaked loudly from the unexpected counterforces, and everyone fell and slid in all directions as the Sovereignty slowly restabilized itself and regained its horizontal attitude. Ravsez and Artur were spilled to the other side of the bar in a dark wave of toxic libation, causing Artur to laugh giddily. "Skybards! Fire the bladders full! Full, I say! Sing us skyward!" came Sifa's cry from outside, and moments later a concussive boom came from the back of the ship. Ravsezi held on to Artur in the sloshing liquor pool as the ship's prow fell beneath them. Ravsez heard many shouts at once, both female and male. "Bladder Beta is high on the aft. Bladder Alpha on the fore won't blow. The pilot is lit, but the hatch is stuck. If it blows, we'll lose the prow. We're nosing down." "Douse the pilot and get out of there," screamed Sifa above the shouts. "Get to the main mast with the gale swallows and be ready for my command. Aft Bladder Beta, lower the fire and let her sink us gently so we don't lose the bowsprit. Wind tamers keep us steady. All hands to the foremast and unfurl her sail as she lays so she catches the upwinds. I repeat, use her to seize the upwinds, lash her down and don't let her leave us. Gion Jabbar, aim through the clouds and find us a home. Keelman, raise the blade, raise the blade." Ravsez held Artur tightly with her right arm as the floor continued sloping downward until much of the liquor rushed over the bar and splashed onto the common room floor, surging up the companionway stairs and taking chairs and tables along with it. People slid along the floor and caught themselves along the frame of the companionway. Shamku was there to grab anyone who fell through. Ravseza held onto Artur tightly with her right arm and planted her feet on the back of the bar, bracing herself against the wall behind her as dark alcohol swirled around her legs like an outgoing tide. The ship's bowsprit suddenly broke through the storm, and Ravsezi beheld with horror through the companionway frame, the starlit distant landscape on the other side of the mountains, rising steadily to meet them. Beyond the eastern highlands and foothills of the mountains loomed dark forests, and beyond the dark forests, a wide expanse of star-reflected water stretched all the way to the horizon. Ravsez couldn't believe her eyes as a gust of wind suddenly tore through the common room. The ship shifted from side to side while struggling against the crosswinds beneath the storm above. "That's it! Lasses and lads, gentlemen and ladies!" cried Sifa. "Steady as she goes! Skybards on the aft deck! Lower the aft bladder 2 and 10 degrees! Gales, wallows and 4 skybards! Now capture these upwinds to raise the prow! Glide us in and let us not fall like a tack! Gion Jabbar! I see water there! Drive there and lay us down gently like a king's daughter!" Ravsez felt the prow slowly lift as the entire ship shook so violently that she imagined it breaking apart before they reached the water. Falling back down behind the wet, sticky bar, she held Arthur close with her right arm. "Hold on to me, son," she whispered in his ear as the ship rattled all around her. "It's temporary. It's temporary." Wind screamed into the common room as the Sovereignty descended through the lower altitudes, and the ship's hull scraped against the upper canopy of the thick forests east of the mountains. Large branches flew up and over the ship, and entire treetops sailed on either side of the prow like waves of trees breaking against the hull. Ear-shattering scrapes and groans against the hull from hundreds of ancient trees being cut down by the Sovereignty cleaved the winds in a cacophonous symphony of torturous discord. Ravsez softly sang the chorus of an old Unscavian children's tune into her son's wet ear. "I will soon dine with thee, O pantomime of mine, at a table rich and free with your hand inside of mine. And when the moons collide, never again to shine, only with you I'll abide, O my pantomime of mine." All of a sudden, there was no sound except for the wind, and within the wind came a shout from the wild and unruly Sienjan helmsman. "Jon Jabbar! Jon Jabbar! Sovereignty! Sovereignty!" As the prow of the ship slammed into open water, Ravsez was crushed against the back of the bar. A white jet of ice-cold fresh water blasted into the common room from the companionway, as if a dam broke. In moments, the entire common room filled to the ceiling with crystal-clear water, as the Sovereignty dove headlong into the sea. Ravsez held her breath as she gripped Arthur, and for several heartbeats she and her son were buoyant, floating gently up from behind the bar. Giant tree branches, broken chairs and tables, dozens of people, and innumerable pieces of debris filled the common room and floated lazily in the water. Gazing out through the companionway, Ravsez saw nothing but black emptiness beyond the ship's shattered bowsprit. Abruptly, Ravsez felt the ship rise to meet her, and they were pushed high up into the air, with all of the water draining from the common room in all directions, leaving it flooded with knee-deep water. The forecastle dove back down into the sea, and large thunderous waves crashed over the sides and washed over it. After what felt like a lifetime, the ship bobbed upward again. Dove, rose, then dove again until finally settling on the water, listing slightly to the port side. A loud groaning sound accompanied by thunderous cracking broke the brief silence, as the top of the main foremast finally gave way and plunged over the side and into the sea with its base still lashed to the ship by hundreds of ropes. The weight of the gigantic mast further listed the Sovereignty on the port side, threatening to capsize the ship. "Keelman, drop the blade full!" cried Sifa's cracked and weathered voice. The ship shuttered all over as the huge keel lowered to full extension into the water to keep the Sovereignty from rolling over from the broken foremast's weight. "Drop starboard anchors fore and aft now! Moor us down starboard!" Sifa yelled. Then there were 2 loud splashes followed by large, heavy ship chains rolling quickly against the hull from their hatches. Ravsez and Arthur, trembling and lacquered with all the Sovereignty's combined liquor, slowly peeked their heads above the bar as a shout from the remaining crew gained momentum from the upper deck. "Jon Jabbar! Jion Jabbar, sovereignty, sovereignty! Then a new chant emerged between the first chants. Sifa! Sifa! Long live Sifa! Huzzah! Through the companionway, Ravsesi saw the Xianjian helmsman, Jion Jabbar, drenched from head to toe, rising from beneath several broken boards, still gripping a piece of the broken wooden helm above his head, to join the chant. Behind him, the shattered remains of the prow were witness to the struggle to save the ship. Woodboards were buckled, peeled backwards, splintered and sticking up in all directions, or shorn off completely. Beyond the damaged prow, the serene black sea reflected the stars above. Ravsesi couldn't believe the Xianjian helmsman survived at all. For long days and nights, as the wild lands primordially shifted, mountains rolled and forests marched, lakes reformed and rivers changed course, the wounded sovereignty lay anchored leaning on its side in the deep, unnamed sea after its disastrous flight over the tall, unnamed mountain range that only a day before blocked its way. Now, a week later, the surrounding lands were utterly different than when they splashed down, and the mountains to the west were now a distant rumour along the horizon to the north. Some claimed it was a miracle that the sovereignty held together at all during its catastrophic descent. Others pronounced its survival was a testament to multicultural ingenuity, and that alone was enough to prove the sovereignty's success. But in all cases, the conversations led to one truth. Without returning home, the mission meant nothing. Not long after, the discussions became split between returning home immediately or continuing to Keodaneth for supplies before returning to Cannonia. But these conversations also led to one singular truth. No matter what, the ship had to be repaired, and that would take a long while, especially with Wilhelmina gone. The large breach left by Hiero's fiery transformation had been hastily repaired by the ship's engineers for the most part, but the sovereignty had already taken on enough water to leave it listing portside at an angle of almost 20 degrees. After nearly a week since splashdown, crew and passengers alike continuously worked on pumping water out of the sovereignty's flooded hull. Many parts of the lower decks had collapsed, hampering repair efforts. Specifically, the ship's hold was completely blocked and inaccessible, and Sifa said it would be at least a month before they were able to even get inside to survey the damage and evaluate food stores, assuming it would all be rotten and contaminated by then, eventually causing sickness among the survivors. Many members of the crew and passengers were missing from the disaster. Prince Tharil of Dolgethad, among those who survived, had taken over guide responsibilities. Using the sovereignty's 3 remaining tenders to row back and forth from ship to shore, and utilising everything he had learned from Piecora, he proved to be indispensable. He organised and led shore parties for hunting game, gathering food, and searching for those lost from the ship. Doglia also served in the shore parties, being placed in charge of logistics and personnel. Together, both he and Prince Tharil commanded the shore efforts smoothly and efficiently between the sovereignty and the surrounding ever-changing wildlands, and they grew to become friends. Leonidas Diolus, the ship's carpenter-surgeon, managed and mended the wounded. He keenly missed the assistance of Orchid, who was counted among the missing. The crew made Sifa Penrose the captain of the sovereignty when they learned of Ojomvedol's fate. The survivors held a sombre memorial in remembrance of everyone who perished or went missing while passing over the mountains. And Sifa did not take the captainship gladly as she lost both her dear friend Ojom and her beloved Cleisthenes. For Ravsesi and Urtor, it was still hard to accept Piecora's loss during the memorial, and even afterward, but perhaps this was due to both of their ability to communicate with Hiero. Ravsesi was quite shocked when she learned that her son also heard Piecora's voice from Hiero, but then she also knew that the two of them had their own connection with her, and Piecora loved them both. Love is not so fickle that it should only serve one person, Ravsesi thought to herself. If it is true and bountiful, there should be enough for everyone to partake. Each day during that first week, Ravziz would walk along the deck with her broken left arm bent in a sling of torn linen from a garment she purchased in Knightsport, helping in what little ways she could, such as bringing water to crew members, mending sails, cleaning rooms and washing clothes. She found her skills and experience while living with the Mutton servant class to be useful and appreciated among the sovereignty's survivors, or the sovereign survivors, as they would eventually call themselves. For the first few days after splashdown, she spoke in her mind with Hero flying overhead, and it caught on among the crew that she could communicate with the raptor. Thus, Hero was given the role of diligently watching the shoreline for any dangers and accompanying the shore parties to help Prince Tharil's guidance through the ever-changing wildlands. On the following day, after 1 week since the sovereignty settled on the sea, Ravzesi decided to begin a journal written in Onscavian, Muthan, and Low Canonian. She felt it might be a good idea if none of them survived and the wildlands claimed the ship, so that maybe someday someone might discover the book and learn of their adventure. She also wanted to write it for Ortor, for the eventuality that he would leave her and start a family of his own, or live his life as he saw fit when he became an adult. She would give him this book as a gift. But mostly, she wrote it for herself, as a means of coping with the loss of Piecora. She realised after a week of sinking despair that she just didn't know of any possible way to get past her grief, at least not on her own. Orchid might have been the only one that could have helped her, but she was gone as well. Ravzesi felt more alone than ever before in her life, and yet she couldn't show it to anyone, not even Ortor. She wanted to be strong for her son and encourage him to be as involved as he could in all the work necessary for repairing the ship and accompanying the shore parties. Ortor had boundless energy and seemingly no fear of anything, and very quickly the sovereign survivors came to depend on him for just about everything, including the servant work that she had taught him when they lived in Edungzirk. No, she had to keep her grief to herself. Of all the survivors, only Ortor and Doglia knew of her inner sadness, and Doglia knew that trying to help her only made things worse on account of who he was and what he represented, neither of which he could fix despite the generosity and integrity of his heart. It became apparent to them both early on that it was best if he kept his distance, though he looked after Ortor when he and his son went to shore together. Unfortunately for Ravzes, this only served to increase her loneliness, but she felt like she had little choice in the matter, for nothing could mend her heart during that first week. When she began her journal, she spent that whole first day in her room introducing her book to the events of the sovereignty, beginning with the unforgettable launch day. Later that night, as she returned to bed after lighting a lamp in the bedroom, she noticed a shaft of bluish-white light on the pages of her journal as she began to write. Looking out through the portal above her bed, she saw the white moon, Vaishlerimund in Muthan, Albamaluna in Canonian, rising in full above the peaks of the distant forested shoreline. Unexpected tears suddenly streamed down her face as she gazed at the moon. She slid from her bed and ran from her room in her long sleep shirt to the sewing room where Ortor was helping several others darn holes in the crew's socks. "Ortor, come, look!" she cried, and grabbing his hand, she dragged him from the room and up through the common room and out the companionway to the forecastle, then turned and ran the entire length of the ship to the stern where she finally stopped and pointed to the rising full white moon. She knelt beside him and hugged him tightly with her right arm and said, "That's your moon, son. They sang praise to Vaishlerimund when you were born. Eindon said it was the blessing of Belmaugri inside you. Now it returns and looks down on us and protects us." Ravzes couldn't believe the words coming from her mouth, having never believed in such astrological superstitions before. But despite her own cynicism, it was the first thing that gave her hope since passing over the mountains. From some distant, remote part of her, she worried that she might be descending into madness, born from grief, when she might start seeing signs and wonders in the mundane. She read about such afflictions before while living in Veklischer Mansion, and she exhibited all of the symptoms written in that book. Otter put his arm around her and kissed her forehead nurturingly, then pressed his head against hers and said, "They both do, Mumi. The moon and Piecora. They watch over us together, both from the sky, night and day." Ravsaz then buried her head in Otter's chest and wept until he guided her back to her bed, tucked her beneath the blankets, and blew out the lamp. The following morning she woke up late to the smell of cooked bacon and potatoes. She jotted down in her journal about the coming of the white moon and how it gave her joy, and the words that Otter said to her. Then she hopped down, got dressed while keeping her broken arm from its sleeve, and went to the common room to eat. Nobody sat or spoke with her, but she was content in her solitude, at least for the time being. When she finished eating, she walked out into the bright sun and strolled to the back of the ship to reimagine the light of the moon from the previous night. Several crew people were gathered there, leaning against the railing and pointing here and there at the distant tree line. In the sky above the trees, she saw Hero soaring high overhead. In her mind she said, "Good morning, my love," but no response came. She repeated several more times, but still no response. Worry suddenly crept into her that maybe their connection wasn't meant to last, and Piecora's soul had somehow departed during the night, or diminished entirely, or was absorbed within Hero. Maybe Hero was now just a wild falcon hunting for food, freed from his soul bond. "Now I am truly alone," she thought to herself. A pit of emptiness formed inside of her that felt like a physical hole, and she completely lost her appetite, thinking anything she might eat or drink would be lost in that hole, and never again provide her nourishment. The small group of people walked away from the railing, leaving her alone with her dreary thoughts. But then a deep voice behind her said, "Ah, poor Unscavian, when shall this tragedy end for you? I commend you on your decision to write. Writing will help you mend from your pain. Reading it later will gain you context from which you will grow." The words came in Canonian Low Common, but with a heavy Heliclesian accent, and Ravsesi knew immediately who spoke them. She spun around at the words to see the huge, hulking Heliclesian man, Shamku, sitting bare-chested on a stool with a large book in his lap. It was the first time she had seen this gigantic, muscular man with a book, let alone a large, decorative book like the one he was reading. The combination of the two nearly knocked her over. He completely dispelled all stereotypes of sailors as illiterate degenerates from a single glance, and even more so from his eloquent speech. Not even Piecora knew how to read, she thought to herself. "Good sir," she responded awkwardly, resorting as always to her Muthan's social protocols. "What is that you are reading? It is a wonderfully beautiful book. If I may say, its calligraphy is wondrous and eloquent, obviously shaped by a gifted hand." He slowly closed the book and showed her the cover. The leather cover had the silhouette of the sovereignty burnished into it, and above the illustration were the words, "Letters of the World, a Heliclesian's account, by Shamku, a simple sailor." "'Tis my own writing, milady," he said slowly. "That is my purpose on this ship, to travel the world and chronicle what I see. I hope it shall be useful one day to later generations." His voice rolled out of his mouth like the gentle thunder of a distant storm that follows its own migratory path. Ravsez was completely stunned by the mere existence of this man before her. She stammered, That is a most magnificently noble endeavour, my lord." She knew that she should say more, but all of her words had collided within her mouth. She suddenly felt as if she were standing before a king seated in his throne. Shamku raised his hand dismissively, stood up, and laid the book on the stool. He was at least the height of two of her, maybe only up to his shoulders. She stared up at him as the sun's light glistened from his smooth, ebony skin and bald head. He wore simple, baggy breeches striped in red and green that were badly torn in multiple places. He stood beside her and rested his gigantic hands on the railing. I should mend those for you, said Rav Caesar, pointing at his pants. He waved a hand dismissively again and said, These are all that I have. You can mend these only if you can make me another to wear while you mend. Then he looked down at her, smiled with his brilliantly white teeth, and chuckled merrily. I never properly thanked you for saving me and my son, my lord, she said. I am Shamku, he said kindly. I am no lord, just a humble man, a simple sailor. Says so on the book, after all. Call me Shamku. I am Rav Cis, and I am no lady, Rav Sisi said, rolling her eyes with an awkward giggle, as she found the statement strangely funny to herself. Please just call me Rav Cis, and Ortor. He is my son. Your heroism. I cannot believe what you did for us, Shamku. I know that I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for you. I owe you everything. He lifted his hand gently, dismissing her words again, and said, You do not owe me anything, Rav Cis. I am no hero. I only live. And others should live too, should they not? If I can help with that, then I do. We come and we go, and every little act, gesture and word affects others, whether we mean it or not, and whether they know it or not. I live so that I can learn and help others. I ask for nothing from you other than what you willingly give from your heart, but not for reward or compensation, only for kindness, only for grace. I will accept no other offering. Rav Seze mulled his words around in her head, finding it still hard to believe such a creature exists in this world. Were all Heliclesians like this? Then a new thought came to her. Were you friends with Vinexi back in Coast Haven? She asked. I saw you together before the fight broke out in the Knife's Edge. He chuckled again, deeply within himself, and Rav Sezi saw the motions roll down the muscles in his back like waves on the ocean. Ah, Vinexi, my dear boy, my sweet devilkin, he said. Yes, we were friends. I tried to get him to come along, but he will not return to the wildlands, not ever, not even for Piecora. I teased him for that, called him a city rat, which does bear truth. He then shrugged his shoulders and concluded, Alas, it was good that he denied me. It probably saved him. If I see him again, though, I will tell him he missed the adventure of his life. I will make him jealous, the little rat. Both can be true, Shamku, said Rav Zeze. He certainly missed an adventure none of us will ever forget, but he might not have survived it like many of us. Indeed, he agreed soberly. After a moment of silence between them, he pointed at Hero, circling high above, and said, I hear that you and the raptor can speak. What does he say to you? Rav Sisi slumped her shoulders, reminded again of Piecora's absence. We used to communicate, she and I, she said sadly. But not today. I think she is finally lost. Forever. A shadow loomed over her, blotting out the sun, and looking up she saw his face leaning down over her like a benevolent boulder in the sky. Not lost, he said quietly. Never lost. She lives in your writing and in mine. She lives forever now. As he straightened, the sun once again bathed her in its warmth. His simple words struck her deeply, much like Piecora's words used to. May I read what you wrote, some day? She asked nervously. Of course, he said jovially. Any time you like. I'm not going anywhere any time soon. He gave a small bow, then walked off, leaving the book on the stool. Turning to lean over the railing, she saw empty skies where Hero flew only moments before, and her heart sank. Maybe the bird had finally flown away on its own accord, rested free from this whole soul bond business. Maybe none of it was real after all. She laid her chin on the railing and decided to return to her room to lay down, fatigue threatening to overwhelm her again. But before she turned to leave, she noticed a single bright green leaf floating in the water beside the ship's right rudder. She did not recognize it as a leaf from the shore, but rather it resembled the kind of leaf that grows from freshwater aquatic plants, like lily pads, serpent tails and bubble blooms. She looked around and cast her eyes across the sea around the ship, but nowhere else did she find another leaf. That night, she stood at the stern in the very same place as earlier in the day and gazed at the rising white moon filling the sky, weeping openly at the good fortunes and contentment that Grunaeirmond was supposed to bring. All of the survivors rejoiced at the coming of the white moon, as it brought them hope and lifted their spirits. All but her. She would hate the white moon and curse it openly for mocking her if it didn't sedate her in its cool, tranquil light. Thus, she was reduced to crying at the moon late in the night, for nothing could abate her tears. "Mumi, come to bed," said Arthur behind her. She felt his arms wrap around her waist and beckon her to leave the railing, and as her eyes trailed downward to follow the moon's reflection across the still surface of the sea, she saw several more green leaves floating in the water next to the rudder. She furrowed her brow as the curiosity briefly replaced her grief, and she squinted at the black water around the leaves. "Where are they coming from?" she mumbled to herself. "Mumi," said Arthur quietly. "Come, Mumi, you need sleep. You haven't been well lately. I'm worried about you." Slowly she turned from the railing and let her son guide her back across the ship, passing numerous people on the deck who watched her with concern and shared in her sorrow. Again, Arthur tucked her into bed, blew out the lamp, and left the room to his own room. Since they had settled into the sea, Arthur had been sleeping in his own room and bed, as many of the rooms had become vacant since losing so many passengers over the mountains. Ravsesi saw it as the first sign of losing her son, and this only furthered her despair and loneliness. Though she continued trying to conceal her anguish, it became harder each day and night. The next morning she walked through the common room slowly, wearing only her sleep shirt with the crest of the sovereignty embroidered below the left shoulder, her bare feet making no sound. She hadn't washed in days, and her long, ragged sleep shirt was stained from general wear and weathering. Her alabaster skin had taken on the shade of a pale celadon porcelain vase. She ignored the food laid out for breakfast, and the other passengers sharing their meal in small groups. Ravses drifted along the top deck to the stern and looked down at the water below. This time, she counted dozens of leaves floating in the water around both rudders. Someone came to stand next to her, silent and patient. When she looked up, Ravses saw Sifa Penrose, holding her wide-brimmed leather hat in her hand, revealing her long brown hair pulled back tightly in a single ponytail. "How are you feeling today, Ravses?" Sifa asked, with worry deeply etched in her face. The words came distantly to Ravsesa, and Sifa seemed like a stranger to her. "Ravses, I want you to know that we are your family," Sifa said. "I consider you more than a passenger here, more than my crew. We are all together in this now, and we must look after each other." Ravsesa stared out at the sky over the distant trees, wondering if she might see Hero again, or the moon if she were allowed to stay long enough. Sifa put her arm around her and said, "My dear friend, I care so much about your plight, yet I know not what to do. You will not let Leo check you over, so we do not know if it is sickness in the mind or the heart or the body. I will drop everything if it helps you to speak of what is ailing you, and I will keep it between us and no one else will ever know. Please, Ravses, we are worried about you, and your son worries especially." "You mustn't stop what you are doing, milady," Ravses said. Her words came slowly and quietly, as if she were still sleeping. "You are captain now. You brought them over the mountains. Without you, they are lost. Darling, please come sit with me and tell me of your troubles," Sifa pleaded. Ravsesi stood on her toes and pointed down to the water. "What is happening down there?" she asked quietly. Her voice cracked like old paper in her own ears. "I don't know," said Sifa, sighing deeply. "My guess is it's coming from the hold. Probably flooded and all the food's gone bad in there. Now we have this vegetation growing out from under the stern, right through the boards. Everything's probably rotted from within, and we can't even get to it. Horrible situation. This is what worries me most. We could fix everything else on the ship, but if the stern is compromised from within, if it's just gone to pulp and separates the centerline, we could lose the rudders. We could lose everything, and it'll all fall out from under us. We might as well scuttle the ship and make for Keodaneth on foot." Sifa's words landed heavily within Ravsiz, and her legs gave out from beneath her. Sifa caught her and said, "Gods, you're as light as a leaf. Are you eating anything? Let's get you back to bed. Leo! Someone get Leo to Ravsiz's room. I need him to look at her." Sifa then picked her up in both arms and walked her all the way across the ship, down the companionway, through the common room, and finally to Ravsiz's bed, where she laid Ravsiz down to sleep. Late that night, Ravsizi bawled loudly at the white moon again, while leaning over the stern. She shouted in her native Devilkin language, "Ahamva amvetsi shortek! Ahamva amvetsi shortek!" which loosely translated in Canonian Low Common as, "I hate you." She then crouched into a ball in the shadow of the stern's gunwale below the railing, hiding from the white moon's light. Opening her eyes, she saw all of the survivors standing on the deck watching her with great concern. Sifa and Doglia stood nearby together, their arms behind each other. Awurtor was nearest to her, but he looked worried and afraid for his mother, wringing his hands and not knowing what to do. Ravzeza screamed at them through her tears. "Give alms to Hirhanyakandra! Give thanks to your Alba Miluna! Give praise to Vaishlerimund! The light of the white moon provides and gives life. Except for me who still lives in shadow, I alone am lost in darkness. I alone am nothing but grief. I have nothing left in this world." Without warning, staring wildly about her and seeing only strange faces lit in the serene light of the white moon, Ravziz threw herself in her madness over the railing as everyone gasped and ran to catch her, but were too late. She plunged painfully into the cold, leafy water beside the stern, letting the water swallow her whole and the thick aquatic vines gently wrap around her. Distantly, she was aware of several other splashes beside her own, but she didn't care. All she wanted was the blissful embrace of darkness and the end of her existence. Ravses awoke to bright sunlight warming her pale skin. She heard birds chirping all around her, the little ones of infinite varieties that she found around the gardens of Veklisha Mansion. The sound of a babbling stream trickled somewhere nearby, and her sinuses were filled with the smells of sweet, fertile soil and wildflowers. Her head no longer ached, and the bitter taste in her mouth that she had for over a week was finally gone. A powerful serenity filled her, seeping into every fibre of her being from the soft, padded, mossy earth beneath her. She slowly opened her eyes to find herself lying on her side. Bright green blades of grass filled her field of view and tickled her face. Ravziz slowly moved her limbs and felt luxurious, cool grass across her bare feet and hands. Her sleep shirt was dry, clean and mended. She sat up and looked around in sleepy amazement, at first thinking she was dreaming. But then she wondered if this might be her afterlife, or wherever her soul was destined to go after she died. Gradually, her memories returned of the sovereignty disaster, and her descent into unreconcilable despair and madness. She remembered hitting the water at night and being devoured by vines. And then she woke up to whatever this was. It was bright as the afternoon, but the lighting was wrong, coming at her sideways instead of above. She looked up and saw a high ceiling completely covered in bright green vines and flowers of many different colours. Tiny birds flitted overhead between the vines, leaves and flowers. Bees hummed all around her, near the ground, pollinating the flowers. She realized that she sat within a patch of bright green grass and flowers, and beyond the flowers were tilled rows of vegetables and berry bushes. Covering the walls beyond the gardens were creeping vines of berries of every kind. The smell of this place reminded her of spring in the gardens of the mansion, yet condensed and contained within this chamber. She reached for a flower and held it close to her face. Orchids, she thought to herself. Orchids of every kind. Orchids. As the revelation occurred to her, she sat up on her knees and spun around to behold a young sapling deciduous tree growing right behind her from the ground to the ceiling, and all around the tree was a thick, vast network of interlacing vines. Within these vines were green cocoons of overlapping leaves, each the size, form and silhouette of a person. To her amazement, she realized that the sunlight was the soft glow of the sapling tree. From the tree's base trickled a small brook that wound its way through the grounds and into the gardens. The water in the brook carried the sweet, rejuvenating smell of tree sap. She recoiled from the tree and the cocoons, suddenly afraid. "What is this place?" she gasped. "Orchid, is this you? Where am I? What have you done with my soul?" But no answer came, and the garden seemed to fully contain her voice as if no sounds could escape it. The garden was warm and humid, like the inside of a greenhouse, and she felt a gentle rocking in the soil from side to side, as if she were on a boat. A boat? Her mind reeled at the sudden thought. Hopping to her feet with renewed energy, she whirled around to take in the entire chamber around her. Everything was covered in thick, luscious grass, flowers and moss, and she realized that these bumps and mounds were vaguely shaped like barrels, crates and boxes. "The hold! I'm in the hold! I'm in the sovereignty!" Her mind burst with each sudden realization as she spun around to gaze at everything with wide eyes. She jogged over to a specifically peculiar mound and dug her fingers into the grass, ripping the earth away to see underneath. Sure enough, she peeled back the sod to reveal the top of a wooden barrel, one of many that she had seen in the hold when she last held Piecora. "Piecora!" she shouted, suddenly feeling a whole new ascension of madness overtaking her if it weren't for the clarity in her mind and the peace in her heart. She jogged back over to the tree and felt along its soft contours. "Orchid, what have you done?" she pleaded. She then fell to her knees and scooped water into her mouth from the brook, and it tasted of pure, clean mountain runoff, with a hint of Orchid's rejuvenating essence. She hopped back up and went to either side of the young tree, thrusting her hands into the thick vines and feeling each of the cocoons. "Orchid, what are you doing here?" she asked again. She randomly picked one of the cocoons and peeled back the layers of leaves from the top, revealing the peacefully sleeping face of Wilhelmina Weisskramur. She placed her hand on the young Muthen woman's cheek and felt her forehead. Warmth. She held her fingers before Willie's mouth and felt the soft, rhythmic breaths of someone in deep sleep. Ravziz's eyes filled with tears as she couldn't believe her discovery. "Orchid," she whispered softly. "Did you save them? All of them? Winds of my soul, souls of my ancestors, blood of the earth, heat of the sun, light of the sky, peace of Grunaeirmond," she chanted breathlessly to herself as she went to each cocoon and peeled back the leaves to reveal the faces of everybody in the hunting party who died in the lower decks. Seemingly a lifetime ago, all now sleeping deeply. Finally she came to the final cocoon, and peeling back the outer leaves of the top of the cocoon revealed the stoic face of Piecora, framed by her loose, black, unbraided straight hair. Ravzeze stepped back, unable to breathe and afraid to accept any of this as real. Then she slowly stepped forward and held her hand to Piecora's face and felt her soft skin in her palm. Piecora's breaths and slow pulse indicated she was in a deep sleep just like the others. Ravzeze stood on her toes and held Piecora's face in both her hands, leaned forward, and kissed Piecora gently on the lips. "Piecora," Ravsés whispered shakily. "Wake up, please, my love." Piecora's eyes slowly fluttered opened, and she inhaled deeply from her nose. "Ravsesa," Piecora breathed softly. Ravsesi threw her arms around Piecora and cried with tears of such joy that she wondered if there might not be anything left of her afterward. "How long have I slept?" Piecora asked tiredly in Ravsesi's ear. "Where are we?" Ravsesi gently peeled back the rest of the cocoon until Piecora awkwardly stepped down to the soft, fertile earth. She wore nothing, not even her antlers, as she leaned on Ravsés and looked around her in wonder. "What is this place?" she asked. "I believe we're in the hold of the ship, the Sovereignty. Do you remember?" Ravsés said. This is where you—" Ravsés choked and couldn't say the rest. Piecora knelt to her knees and said, "Yes, I remember. I remember Stag visited me and took me to the realm of the spirits, the hunting grounds. I rode on its back. It judged me favourably. But I wanted to return. We rode through the grasses, and I was happy. But I wanted to return." Ravsesa pointed to the other cocoons and said, "See there, all of the others are saved. There is Ogiom, and there is Wilhelmina, and Cleisthenes, and the rest. They are sleeping like you were." Piecora followed her gesture and slowly shook her head. How did this happen? Then, unexpectedly, she quickly turned and grabbed Ravses's arms. "Wait! Ortur! The party! The creature! Where are they? Stag, are we all dead?" Ravsés sat next to Piecora in the soft shade of the glowing tree and recounted the tale of the passage over the mountains and how they came to settle on a wide-open sea in the wildlands east of the mountains. With great difficulty, Ravsés told her about her own descent into grief that she tried to heal through writing, but to no avail, despite the kindness of Shamku, Sifa, and her son. She eventually threw herself over the railing at the ship's stern, fell into the water, and was consumed by the vines. Piecora stared absently with her brow furrowed as she listened until she said, "You were brought here. This whole place, something has taken it over, something very powerful and benign. We are in a spiritual place, changed by the essence of this spirit." Piecora slowly rose up and unsteadily walked over to the rows of tilled earth while leaning on Ravsesi. Ravsesi decided to let Piecora arrive at the truth herself. "This is a garden," she said, her eyes filled with wonder. "Orchid. She is counted among the missing. We never found her," Ravsesi whispered while smiling. "Not missing," Piecora said. "Not lost. Never lost. She lives here now. Forever." Ravsés cocked her head to the side and changed her expression to genuine curiosity. "Shamku said those same words to me, almost exactly word for word, the day before I fell from the ship," said Ravsés. "Perhaps Orchid speaks through us all," Piecora said. "Perhaps she is listening, and this is how we convene with her, and she us." Unexpectedly, Piecora lifted Ravsesi in her bare arms and kissed her passionately. "In your grief, you gave yourself to the sea, but in doing so you came back to me," said Piecora breathlessly, as if suddenly realizing the full magnitude of Ravses's love, grief, and sacrifice. "If you hadn't done so, none of this would have been discovered. They would have scuttled the ship. We would have been forgotten, left at the bottom of this unpredictable sea, consumed by the wildlands. But Orchid brought you to me." Ravsés returned her passionate affection while nearly bursting with heated joy. Finally, they looked around each other and gazed at the gardens with renewed wonder. "Look around us," Piecora said. "The gardens fill the entirety of the ship's hold. There's enough food down here for weeks upon weeks. Pure water, too. Look how the stream comes from the tree to feed the gardens. Orchid feeds this garden. She feeds us all and gives us life. Orchid is the garden. Come, let's free the others, Ravzizi said, filled with gratitude to have Piecora again by her side. Hearing the Senjan guide's unique perspective on all of this, based on her spiritual awareness and understanding of the metaphysical that no Canonian or Muthan could relate to, was something she cherished about her and this moment more than anything else. A while later, all members of the assassin hunting party were gathered together, completely bare of clothing as they quietly discussed their options while eating various vegetables and berries from the surrounding gardens beneath the glowing young sapling tree. Finally, Ogiom commanded everyone to disperse and wander the gardens to count everything, so they could roughly estimate what they had and how much of it there was. During this time, Ravzizi heard a sudden thump, followed by several others. Everyone quietly came together to seek out where the sounds came from. Willie squeaked as one of the thumps split through the mossy earth near her head. She hopped away as an axe blade cleaved again through the mossy wall. More thumps followed, until Ogiom called out, "Speak your name, ye who comes here with axes!" The pounding and tearing stopped, and in the silence Ravziz heard a muffled, "Ogiom?" "Aye, it is you, Sifa," he cried. "Gods and spirits, I am happy to hear your voice. Come, let us make through this membrane." Everyone pulled together at the thick grass, earth and moss, until a wound appeared in the wall, and through the wound revealed by the garden's light were large pieces of splintered timber lying at odd angles lit by several hanging lamps. Artur was the first inside the garden, as he was the smallest, and when he saw Ravziz he jumped into her arms. "Mummy!" he shouted. "Artur, my love!" she cried, and she buckled to her knees embracing her son. Piecora ran over to them both and wrapped her arms around them. Hero flew in over everyone's heads, folding his wings through the gash in the wall and then banking up to land near the top of the young tree. The tiny garden birds all rushed to escape from the garden through the same opening as they became aware in unison of the raptor's presence among them. But Hero ignored them. He flew straight down and laid himself into Piecora's cradling arms, reunited once again with his soul bond. Together, the four of them huddled and rejoiced in shared gladness from being together again. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.